The Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 1. Since a large roll would be inconvenient for handling or reference, literary works were usually divided into several rolls, and the word biblos, or book, was applied not to each work as a whole, but to each roll or part. These divisions were seldom made by the author. Later editors divided the histories of Herodotus into 9 books, the Peloponnesian War of Thucydides into 8, Plato's Republic into 10, the Iliad and the Odyssey into 24. Since papyrus was costly and each copy had to be written by hand, books were very limited in the classic world. It was easier than now to be educated, though as hard as now to be intelligent. Reading was not a universal accomplishment. Most knowledge was handed down by oral tradition from one generation or craftsman to the next. Most literature was read aloud by trained reciters to persons who learned through the ear. There was no reading public in Greece before the 7th century. There were no Greek libraries till those collected by Polycrates and Pisistratus in the 6th. In the 5th century we hear of the private libraries of Euripides and the Archon Euclides. In the 4th, of Aristotle's. We know of no public library before Alexandria's, none in Athens till Hadrian. Perhaps the Greeks of Pericles' day were so great because they did not have to read many books, or any long one. 3. Literature. Literature, like religion, divided and united Greece. The poets sang in their local dialects and often of their native scenes. But all Hellas listened to the more eloquent voices and stirred them now and then to broader themes. Time and prejudice have destroyed too much of this early poetry to let us feel its wealth and scope, its reputed vigor of utterance and finish of form. But as we move through the isles or cities of 6th century Greece, our wonder rises at the abundance and excellence of Greek literature before the Periclean age. The lyric poetry reflected an aristocratic society in which feeling, thought, and morals were free so long as they observed the amenities of breeding. This style of urbane and polished verse tended to disappear under the democracy. It had a rich variety of structure and meter, but seldom shackled itself with rhyme. Rhyme was mostly confined to oracles and religious prophecies. Poetry meant to the Greeks feeling, imaginatively and rhythmically expressed. While the lyric singers tuned their lyres to love and war, the wandering bards in great men's halls recited in epic measures the heroic deeds of the race. Guilds of rhapsodes built up through generations a cycle of lays centering around the sieges of Thebes and Troy and the homing of the warriors. Song was socialized among these minstrels. Each stitched his story together from earlier fragments, and none pretended to have composed a whole sequence of these tales. In Chios, a clan of such rhapsodes called themselves Homeridae, and claimed descent from a poet, Homer, who, they said, was the author of the epics that they recited throughout eastern Greece. Perhaps this blind bard was but an eponym, an imaginary ancestor of a tribe or group, like Helen, Doris, or Ion. The Greeks of the 6th century attributed to Homer not only the Iliad and the Odyssey, but all the other epics then existing. The Homeric poems are the oldest epics known to us, but their very excellence, as well as their many references to earlier bards, suggest that the surviving epics stand at the end of a long line of development from simple lays to lengthy, stitched songs. In 6th century Athens, possibly under Solon, probably under Pisistratus, a governmental commission selected or collated the Iliad and the Odyssey from the epic literature of the preceding centuries, assigned them to Homer, and edited, perhaps wove them, into substantially their present shape. It is one of the miracles of literature that poems so complex in origin achieved in the end so artistic a result. It is quite true that both in language and in structure the Iliad falls considerably this side of perfection, that Aeolian and Ionic forms are mingled as if by some polyglot Smyrnan, and that the meter requires now one dialect and now the other, that the plot is marred by inconsistencies, changes of plan and emphasis, and contradictions of character, that the same heroes are killed 2 or 3 times over in the course of the tale, that the original theme, the wrath of Achilles and its results, is interrupted and obscured by 100 episodes apparently taken from other lays and sewn into the epic at every seam. Nevertheless, in its larger aspects, the story is one, the language is powerful and vivid, the poem is all in all the greatest that ever sounded on the lips of men. Such an epic could have been begun only in the active and exuberant youth of the Greeks, and could have been completed only in their artistic maturity. Its characters are nearly all warriors or their women. Even the philosophers, like Nestor, put up an enviably good fight. These individuals are intimately and sympathetically conceived, and perhaps the finest thing in all Greek literature is the unbiased manner in which we are made to feel now with Hector and now with Achilles. In his tent, Achilles is a thoroughly unheroic and unlikable figure, complaining to his mother that his luck does not befit his semi-divinity, and that Agamemnon has stolen his plum, the unhappy Briseis, letting the Greeks die by the thousands while he eats and pouts and sleeps in his ship or his tent, sending Patroclus unaided to death, and then rending the air with unmanly lamentations. When finally he goes into battle, he is not stirred by patriotism, but mad with grief over the loss of his friend. In his rage he loses all decency, and sinks to savage cruelty with both Lycaon and Hector. In truth, he is an undeveloped mind, unsettled and uncontrolled, and overshadowed with prophecies of death. "Nay, friend," he says to the fallen Lycaon, who sues for mercy, "die like another. What wouldst thou vainly weeping? Patroclus died, who was far better than thou. Look at me. Am I not beautiful and tall, and sprung of a good father, and a goddess the mother that bare me? Yet lo, death is over me, and the mighty hand of doom. There cometh a dawn of day, a noon or an evening, and a hand that I know not shall lay me dead." So he stabs the unresisting Lycaon through the neck, flings the body into the river, and makes one of those grandiose speeches that adorn the slaughter in the Iliad, and laid the foundation for oratory among the Greeks. Half of Hellas worshipped Achilles for centuries as a god. We accept him and forgive him as a child. At the worst, he is one of the supreme creations of the poetic mind. What carries us along through the Iliad when we do not have to study or translate it is not merely these characterizations, so numerous and diverse, nor merely the flow and turmoil of the tale, but the rushing splendor of the verse. It must be admitted that Homer repeats as well as nods. It is part of his plan to recall as in refrain certain epithets and lines. So he sings with fond repetition of "When appeared the morning's daughter, rosy-fingered dawn." But if these are flaws, they are lost in the brilliance of the language and the wealth of similes that now and then, amid the shock of war, calm us with the quiet beauty of peaceful fields. As when flies in swarming myriads haunt the herdsman's stalls in springtime, when new milk has filled the pails, in such vast multitudes mustered the long-haired Greeks upon the plain. Or, as when among the deep dells of an arid mountainside a great fire burns its way, and the thick wood before it is consumed, and shifting winds hither and thither sweep the flames, so ranged Achilles in his fury through the field, from side to side, and everywhere o'ertook his victims, and the earth ran dark with blood. The Odyssey is so different from all this that from the outset one suspects its separate authorship. Even some of the Alexandrian scholars suggested this, and all the critical authority of Aristarchus was required to hush the dispute. The Odyssey agrees with the Iliad in certain standard phrases: owl-eyed Athena, long-haired Greeks, wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn, which may have been taken from the same hoard and poetical tradition into which the authors of the Iliad had dipped their pens. But the Odyssey contains an array of words apparently brought into use after the Iliad was composed. In the second epic we hear frequently of iron, where the earlier one spoke of bronze. We hear of writing, of private property and land, of freedmen and emancipation, none of which are mentioned in the Iliad. The very gods and their functions are different. The meter is the same dactylic hexameter as in all the Greek epics, but the style and spirit and substance are so far from the Iliad that if one author wrote both poems, he was a paragon of complexity and a master of all moods. The new poet is more literary and philosophical, less violent and warlike than the old, more self-conscious and meditative, leisurely and civilized, so gentle indeed that Bentley thought the Odyssey had been composed for the special benefit of women. Whether here, too, we have poets rather than a poet is harder to say than in the case of the Iliad. There are signs of suture, but the stitching seems more skillful than in the older epic. The plot, though devious, turns out in the end to be remarkably consistent, worthy almost of contemporary fictioneers. From the beginning, the conclusion is foreshadowed, every episode advances it, and its coming binds all the books into a whole. Probably the epic was built upon pre-existing lays, as in the case of the Iliad, but the work of unification is far more complete. We may conclude with a high degree of diffidence that the Odyssey is a century younger than the Iliad, and is predominantly the work of one man. The characters are less vigorously and vividly conceived than in the Iliad. Penelope is shadowy, and never quite emerges from behind her loom except in the end, when a moment of doubt, perhaps of regret, flits through her mind at the return of her master. Helen is clear and unique. Here the launcher of 1,000 ships and the cause of 10,000 deaths is still a goddess among women, maturely lovely in her middle age, gentler and quieter than before, but as proud as ever, and taking gracefully for granted all the attentions that hedge in a queen. Nausicaa is a pretty essay in the male understanding of women. We hardly expect so delicate and romantic a picture from a Greek. Telemachus is uncertainly drawn, infected with hesitation as by some Hamlet touch. But Odysseus is the most complete and complex portrait in Greek poetry. All in all, the Odyssey is a fascinating novel in engaging verse, full of tender sentiment and adventurous surprise, more interesting to an unwarlike and aging soul than the majestic and bloody Iliad. These poems, sole survivals of a long succession of epics, became the most precious element in the literary heritage of Greece. Homer was the staple of Greek education, the repository of Greek myth, the source of 1,000 dramas, the foundation of moral training, and, strangest of all, the very Bible of orthodox theology. It was Homer and Hesiod, said Herodotus, probably with some hyperbole, who gave definite and human form to the Olympians and order to the hierarchy of heaven. There is much that is magnificent in Homer's gods, and we come to like them for their failings. But scholars have long since detected in the poets who pictured them a rollicking skepticism hardly befitting a national Bible. These deities quarrel like relatives, fornicate like fleas, and share with mankind what seemed to Alexander the stigmata of mortality, the need for love and sleep. They do everything human but hunger and die. Not one of them could bear comparison with Odysseus in intelligence, with Hector in heroism, with Andromache in tenderness, or with Nestor in dignity. Only a poet of the 6th century, versed in Ionian doubt, could have made such farcelings of the gods. It is one of the humors of history that these epics, in which the Olympians have essentially the function of comic relief, were reverenced throughout Hellas as props of respectable morality and belief. Eventually the anomaly proved explosive. The humor destroyed the belief, and the moral development of men rebelled against the superseded morals of the gods. 4. Games. Religion failed to unify Greece, but athletics periodically succeeded. Men went to Olympia, Delphi, Corinth, and Nemea, not so much to honor the gods, for these could be honored anywhere, as to witness the heroic contests of chosen athletes and the ecumenical assemblage of varied Greeks. Alexander, who could see Greece from without, considered Olympia the capital of the Greek world. Here, under the rubric of athletics, we find the real religion of the Greeks, the worship of health, beauty, and strength. To be in health, said Simonides, is the best thing for man, the next best, to be of form and nature beautiful, the third, to enjoy wealth gotten without fraud, and the fourth, to be in youth's bloom among friends. There is no greater glory for a man as long as he lives, said the Odyssey, than that which he wins by his own hands and feet. Perhaps it was necessary for an aristocratic people, living among slaves more numerous than themselves and frequently called upon to defend their soil against more populous nations, to keep in good condition. Ancient war depended upon physical vigor and skill, and these were the original aim of the contests that filled Hellas with the noise of their fame. We must not think of the average Greek as a student and lover of Aeschylus or Plato. Rather, like the typical Briton or American, he was interested in sport, and his favored athletes were his earthly gods. Greek games were private, local, municipal, and pan-Hellenic. Even the fragmentary remains of antiquity reveal an interesting range of sports. A relief in the Athens Museum shows on one side a wrestling match, on another a hockey game. Swimming, bareback riding, throwing, or dodging missiles while mounted were not so much sports as general accomplishments of all citizens. Hunting became a sport when it ceased to be a necessity. Ball games were as varied then as now and as popular. At Sparta, the terms ball player and youth were synonyms. Special rooms were built in the palaestra for games of ball. These rooms were called sphyristeria, and the teachers were sphyristai. On another relief, we see men bouncing a ball against the floor or the wall and striking it back with the flat of the hand. We do not know whether the players did this in turn, as in modern handball. One ball game resembled Canadian lacrosse, being a form of hockey played with rackets. Pollux, writing in the 2nd century of our era, describes it in almost modern terms. Certain youths, divided into 2 equal groups, leave in a level place, which they have prepared and measured, a ball made of leather about the size of an apple. They rush at it as if it were a prize lying between them, from their fixed starting points. Each of them has in his right hand a racket, ending in a sort of flat bend, whose center is woven with gut strings, plaited like a net. Each side strives to be the first to drive the ball to the opposite end of the ground from that allotted to them. The same author pictures a game in which one team tries to throw a ball over or through an opposed group until one side drives the other back over their goal line. Antiphanes, in an imperfect fragment from the 4th century B.C., describes a star. When he got the ball, he delighted to give it to one player while dodging another. He knocked it away from one and urged on another with noisy cries. Outside, a long pass, beyond him, overhead, a short pass. From these private sports came local and incidental games, as after the death of a hero like Patroclus, or the successful issue of some great enterprise, like the march of Xenophon's 10,000 to the sea. Then came municipal games, in which the contestants represented various localities and groups within one city-state. Almost, but not quite international, were the quadrennial Panathenaic Games, established by Pisistratus in 566. Here the entries were mostly from Attica, but outsiders were welcomed. Besides the usual athletic events, there were chariot races, a torch race, a rowing race, musical competitions for voice, harp, lyre, and flute, dances, and recitations, chiefly from Homer. Each of the 10 divisions of Attica was represented by 24 men chosen for their health, vigor, and good looks, and a prize was awarded to the most impressive 24 for fine manhood. Since athletics were necessary for war, and yet would die without competitions, the cities of Greece, to provide the highest stimulus, arranged Panhellenic Games. The oldest of these were organized as a regular quadrennial event at Olympia in 776 B.C., the first definite date in Greek history. Originally confined to Elians, within a century they were drawing entries from all Greece. By 476 the list of victors ranged from Sinope to Marseille. The Feast of Zeus became an international holiday. A truce was proclaimed to all wars in Greece for the month of the festival, and fines were levied by the Elians upon any Greek state in whose territory a traveler to the games suffered molestation. Philip of Macedon humbly paid a fine because some of his soldiers had robbed an Athenian en route to Olympia. We picture the pilgrims and athletes starting out from distant cities a month ahead of time to come together at the games. It was a fair as well as a festival. The plain was covered not only with the tents that sheltered the visitors from the July heat, but with the booths where 1,000 concessionaires exposed for sale everything from wine and fruit to horses and statuary, while acrobats and conjurers performed their tricks for the crowd. Some juggled balls in the air, others performed marvels of agility and skill, others ate fire or swallowed swords. Modes of amusement, like forms of superstition, enjoy a reverend antiquity. Famous orators like Gorgias, famous sophists like Hippias, perhaps famous writers like Herodotus, delivered addresses or recitations from the porticos of the Temple of Zeus. It was a special holiday for men, since married women were not allowed to attend the festival. These had their own games at the Feast of Hera. Menander summed up such a scene in 5 words: crowd, market, acrobats, amusements, thieves. Only free-born Greeks were allowed to compete in the Olympic Games. The athletes from Athlos, a contest, were selected by local and municipal elimination trials, after which they submitted for 10 months to rigorous training under professional paidotrobai, literally youth rubbers, and gymnastai. Arrived at Olympia, they were examined by the officials and took an oath to observe all the rules. Irregularities were rare. We hear of Eupolis bribing other boxers to lose to him, but the penalty and dishonor attached to such offenses were discouragingly great. When everything was ready, the athletes were led into the stadium. As they entered, a herald announced their names and the cities that had entered them. All the contestants, whatever their age or rank, were naked. Occasionally a girdle might be worn at the loins. Of the stadium itself nothing remains but the narrow stone slabs towed by the runners at the starting point. The 45,000 spectators kept their places in the stadium all day long, suffering from insects, heat, and thirst. Hats were forbidden, the water was bad, and flies and mosquitoes infested the place as they do today. Sacrifices were offered at frequent intervals to Zeus, averter of flies. The most important events were grouped together as the pentathlon, or 5 contests. To promote all-around development in the athlete, each entry in any of these events was required to compete in all of them. To secure the victory, it was necessary to win 3 contests out of the 5. The first was a broad jump. The athlete held weights like dumbbells in his hand and leaped from a standing start. Ancient writers assure us that some jumpers spanned 50 feet, but it is not necessary to believe everything that we read. The second event was throwing the discus, a circular plate of metal or stone weighing about 12 pounds. The best throws are said to have covered 100 feet. The third contest was in hurling the javelin or spear, with the aid of a leather thong attached to the center of the shaft. The fourth and principal event of the group was the stadium sprint, that is, for the length of the stadium, usually some 200 yards. The fifth contest was wrestling. It was a highly popular form of competition in Greece, for the very name Palaestra was taken from it, and many a story was told of its champions. Boxing was an ancient game, almost visibly handed down from Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece. The boxers practiced with punching balls hung on a level with the head and filled with fig seeds, meal, or sand. In the classic age of Greece, that is, the 5th and 4th centuries, they wore soft gloves of oxhide dressed with fat and reaching almost to the elbow. Blows were confined to the head, but there was no rule against hitting a man who was down. There were no rests or rounds. The boxers fought till one surrendered or succumbed. They were not classified by weight. Any man of any weight might enter the lists. Hence, weight was an asset, and boxing degenerated in Greece from a competition in skill into a contest in brawn. In the course of time, as brutality increased, boxing and wrestling were combined into a new contest called the Pankration, or Game of All Powers. In this, everything but biting and eye-gouging was permitted, even to a kick in the stomach. 3 heroes whose names have come down to us won by breaking the fingers of their opponents. Another struck so ferociously with straight extended fingers and strong sharp nails that he pierced the flesh of his adversary and dragged out his bowels. Milo of Crotona was a more amiable pugilist. He had developed his strength, we are told, by carrying a calf every day of its life until it was a full-grown bull. People loved him for his tricks. He would hold a pomegranate so fast in his fist that no one could get it from him, and yet the fruit was uninjured. He would stand on an oiled quoit and resist all efforts to dislodge him. He would tie a cord around his forehead and burst the cord by holding his breath and so forcing blood to his head. In the end he was destroyed by his virtues. For he chanced, says Pausanias, on a withered tree into which some wedges had been driven to separate the wood, and he took it into his head to keep the wood apart with his hands. But the wedges slipped out, he was imprisoned in the tree, and became a prey to the wolves. In addition to the pentathlon sprint, there were other foot races at the Games. One was for 400 yards, another for 24 stadia, or 2 2/3 miles. A third was an armed race in which each runner carried a heavy shield. We have no knowledge of the records made in these races. The stadium differed in length in different cities, and the Greeks had no instruments for measuring small intervals of time. Stories tell of a Greek runner who could outdistance a hare, of another who raced a horse from Corona to Thebes, some 20 miles, and beat it, and of how Phidippides ran from Athens to Sparta, 150 miles, in 2 days, and at the cost of his life brought to Athens the news of the victory at Marathon, 24 miles away. But there were no marathon races in Greece. In the plain below the stadium, Olympia built a special hippodrome for horse races. Women as well as men might enter their horses, and as now the prize went to the owner and not to the jockey, though the horse was sometimes rewarded with a statue. The culminating events of the games were the chariot races, with 2 or 4 horses running abreast. Often 10 4-horse chariots competed together, and as each had to negotiate 23 turns around the posts at the ends of the course, accidents were the chief thrill of the game. In one race with 40 starters, a single chariot finished. We may imagine the tense excitement of the spectators at these contests, their wordy arguments about their favorites, their emotional abandonment as the survivors rounded the last turn. When the toils of 5 days were over, the victors received their rewards. Each bound a woolen fillet about his head, and upon this the judge placed a crown of wild olive, while a herald announced the name and city of the winner. This laurel wreath was the only prize given at the Olympic Games, and yet it was the most eagerly contested distinction in Greece. So important were the games that not even the Persian invasion stopped them, and while a handful of Greeks withstood Xerxes' army at Thermopylae, the customary thousands watched Theagenes of Thasos, on the very day of the battle, win the Pancratiast's crown. "Good heavens!" exclaimed a Persian to his general, "what manner of men are these against whom you have brought us to fight? Men who contend with one another not for money, but for honor." He, or the Greek inventor of the tale, did the Greeks too much credit, and not merely because the Greeks should on that day have been at Thermopylae rather than at Olympia. Though the direct prize at the games was little, The indirect rewards were great. Many cities voted substantial sums to the victors on their return from their triumphs. Some cities made them generals, and the crowd idolized them so openly that jealous philosophers complained. Poets like Simonides and Pindar were engaged by the victor or his patrons to write odes in his honor, which were sung by choruses of boys in the procession that welcomed him home. Sculptors were paid to perpetuate him in bronze or stone, and sometimes he was given free sustenance in the city hall. We may judge the cost of this item when we learn, on questionable authority, that Milo ate a 4-year-old heifer and Theagenes an ox in a day. The 6th century saw the peak of the splendor and popularity of athletics in Greece. In 582, the Amphictyonic League established the Pythian Games in honor of Apollo at Delphi. In the same year, the Isthmian Games were instituted at Corinth in honor of Poseidon. 6 years later, the Nemean Games were inaugurated to celebrate the Nemean Zeus. And all 3 occasions became Pan-Hellenic festivals. Together with the Olympic Games, they formed a periodos, or cycle, and the great ambition of a Greek athlete was to win the crown at all of them. In the Pythian Games, contests in music and poetry were added to the physical competitions, and indeed such musical tilts had been celebrated at Delphi long before the establishment of the athletic games. The original event was a hymn in honor of Apollo's victory over the Delphic Python. In 582, contests were added in singing and in playing the lyre and the flute. Similar musical contests were held at Corinth, Nemea, Delos, and elsewhere, for the Greeks believed that by frequent public competitions they could stimulate not only the ability of the performer, but the taste of the public as well. The principle was applied to almost every art, to pottery, poetry, sculpture, painting, choral singing, oratory, and drama. In this way and others, the games had a profound influence upon art and literature, and even upon the writing of history, for the chief method of reckoning time in later Greek historiography was by Olympiads, designated by the name of the victor in the one-stadium foot race. The physical perfection of the all-around athlete in the 6th century generated that ideal of statuary which reached its fullness in Myron and Polykleitos. The nude contests and games in the palestra and at the festivals gave the sculptor unequaled opportunities to study the human body in every natural form and pose. The nation unwittingly became models to its artists, and Greek athletics united with Greek religion to generate Greek art. 5. Arts. Now that we come at last to the most perfect products of Greek civilization, we find ourselves tragically limited in the quantity of the remains. The devastation caused in Greek literature by time and bigotry and mental fashions is negligible compared with the destruction of Greek art. One classic bronze survives, the charioteer of Delphi. One classic marble statue, the Hermes of Praxiteles. Not one temple, not even the Theseum, has come down to us in the form and color that it had for ancient Greece. Greek work in textiles, in wood, in ivory, silver, or gold is nearly all gone. The material was too perishable or too precious to escape vandalism and time. We must reconstruct the ship from a few planks of the wreckage. The sources of Greek art were the impulses to representation and decoration, the anthropomorphic quality of Greek religion, and the athletic character and ideal. The early Greek, like other primitives, when he outgrew the custom of sacrificing living beings to accompany and serve the dead, buried carved or painted figures as substitutes. Later he placed images of his ancestors in his home, or he dedicated in the temple likenesses of himself or of those whom he loved as votive figurines that might magically win for their models the protection of the god. Minoan religion, Mycenaean religion, even the chthonic cults of Greece were too vague and impersonal, sometimes too horrible and grotesque, to lend themselves to aesthetic form. But the frank humanity of the Olympian gods and their need of temple homes for their earthly stays opened a wide road for sculpture, architecture, and 100 ancillary arts. No other religion, possibly excepting Catholicism, has so stimulated and influenced literature and art. Almost every book or play, statue or building or vase that has come down to us from ancient Greece touches upon religion in subject, purpose, or inspiration. But inspiration alone would not have made Greek art great. There was needed a technical excellence rising out of cultural contacts and the transmission and development of crafts. Indeed, art to the Greek was a form of handicraft, and the artist grew so naturally out of the artisan that Greece never quite distinguished them. There was needed a knowledge of the human body, as in its healthy development the norm of proportion, symmetry, and beauty. There was needed a sensuous, passionate love of beauty that would hold no toil too great that might give to the living moment of loveliness a lasting form. The women of Sparta placed in their sleeping chambers figures of Apollo, Narcissus, Hyacinthus, or some other handsome deity, in order that they might bear beautiful children. Cypselus established a beauty contest among women far back in the 7th century, and according to Athenaeus, this periodical competition continued down to the Christian era. In some places, says Theophrastus, there are contests between the women in respect of modesty and good management, and also there are contests about beauty, as for instance in Tenedos and Lesbos. 1. Vases. There was a pretty legend in Greece that the first cup was molded upon Helen's breast. If so, the mold was lost in the Dorian invasion, for what pottery has come down to us from early Greece does not remind us of Helen. The invasion must have profoundly disturbed the arts, impoverishing craftsmen, scattering schools, and ending for a time the transmission of technology. For Greek vases after the invasion begin again with primitive simplicity and crudity, as if Crete had never lifted pottery into an art. Probably the rough mood of the Dorian conquerors, using what survived of Minoan Mycenaean techniques, produced that geometric style which dominates the oldest Greek pottery after the Homeric age. Flowers, scenery, and plants, so luxuriant in Cretan ornament, were swept away, and the stern spirit that made the glory of the Doric temple contrived the passing ruin of Greek pottery. The gigantic jars that characterized this period made small pretense to beauty. They were designed to store wine or oil or grain, rather than to interest a ceramic connoisseur. The decoration was almost all by repeated triangles, circles, chains, checkers, lozenges, swastikas, or simple parallel horizontal lines. Even the human figures that intervened were geometrical. Torsos were triangles, thighs and legs were cones. This lazy style of ornament spread through Greece and determined the form of the dipylon vases at Athens, so called because they were found chiefly near the double gate of the city at the Ceramicus. But on these enormous containers, usually made to receive the human dead, black silhouettes of mourners, chariots, and animals were drawn, however awkwardly, between the pattern's lines. Towards the end of the 8th century, more life entered into the painting of Greek pottery. 2 colors were used for the ground. Curves replaced straight lines. Palmettes and lotuses, prancing horses, and hunted lions took form upon the clay, and the ornate oriental succeeded the bare geometric style. An age of busy experimentation followed. Miletus flooded the market with its red vases, Samos with its alabasters, Lesbos with its black wares, Rhodes with its whites, Clazomene with its grays, and Naucratis exported faience and translucent glass. Erythrae was famous for the thinness of its vases, Chalcis for brilliance of finish, Sicyon and Corinth for their delicate Proto-Corinthian scent bottles and elaborately painted jugs like the Chigi vase in Rome. A kind of ceramic war engaged the potters of the rival cities. One or another of them found purchasers in every port of the Mediterranean and in the interior of Russia, Italy, and Gaul. In the 7th century, Corinth seemed to be winning. Its wares were in every land and hand. Its potters had found new techniques of incision and coloring, and had shown a fresh inventiveness in forms. But about 550, the masters of the Ceramicus, the potters' quarter on the outskirts of Athens, came to the front, threw off Oriental influence, and captured with their black figureware the markets of the Black Sea, Cyprus, Egypt, Etruria, and Spain. From that time onward, the best ceramic craftsmen migrated to Athens or were born there. A great school and tradition formed as through many generations son succeeded father in the art, and the making of fine pottery became one of the great industries, finally one of the conceded monopolies, of Attica. The vases themselves now and then bear pictures of the potter's shop, the master working with his apprentices, or watchfully supervising the various processes, mixing the pigments and the clay, molding the form, painting the ground, engraving the picture, firing the cup, and feeling the happiness of those who see beauty taking form under their hands. More than 100 of these Attic potters are known to us, but time has broken up their masterpieces, and they are only names. Here on a drinking cup are the proud words, Nikosthenes me poesen. Nikosthenes made me. A greater than he was Exesius, whose majestic amphora is in the Vatican. He was one of many artists encouraged by patronage and peace under the Pisistratids. From the hands of Clytius and Ergomatus came, about 560, the famous Francois vase, found in Etruria by a Frenchman of that name, and now treasured in the Archaeological Museum at Florence. A great mixing bowl covered with row upon row of figures and scenes from Greek mythology. These men were the outstanding masters of the black figure style in 6th century Attica. We need not exaggerate the excellence of their work. It cannot compare either in conception or in execution with the best work of the Tang or Sung Chinese. But the Greek had a different aim from the Oriental. He sought not color but line, not ornament but form. The figures on the Greek vases are conventional, stylized, improbably magnificent in the shoulders and thin in the legs, and as this continued through the classic age, we must assume that the Greek potter never dreamed of realistic accuracy. He was writing poetry, not prose, speaking to the imagination rather than the eye. He limited himself in materials and pigments. He took the fine red clay of the ceramicus, quieted its color with yellow, carefully engraved the figures, and filled out the silhouettes with brilliant black glaze. He transformed the earth into a profusion of vessels that wedded beauty and use: hydria, amphora, inochoe, kylix, crater, lekythos, that is, water jug, two-handled jar, wine bowl, drinking cup, mixing bowl, and unguent flask. He conceived the experiments, created the subjects, and developed the techniques that were taken up by bronze workers, sculptors, and painters. He made the first essays in foreshortening, perspective, chiaroscuro, and modeling. He paved the way for statuary by molding terracotta figures in 1,000 themes and forms. He freed his own art from Dorian geometry and Oriental excess, and made the human figure the source and center of its life. Towards the last quarter of the 6th century, the Athenian potter tired of black figures on a red ground, inverted the formula, and created that red figure style which ruled the markets of the Mediterranean for 200 years. The figures were stiff and angular, the body in profile with the eyes in full view, but even within these limits there was a new freedom, a wider scope of conception and execution. He sketched the figures upon the clay with a light point, drew them in greater detail with a pen, filled in the background with black, and added minor touches with colored glaze. Here, too, some of the masters made lasting names. One amphora is signed, painted by Euthymides, son of Polyus, as never Euphronius, which was to challenge Euphronius to equal it. Nevertheless, this Euphronius is still rated as the greatest potter of his age. To him, some think, belongs the great crater on which Heracles wrestles with Antaeus. To his contemporary Sosius is attributed one of the most famous of Greek vases, whereon Achilles binds the wounded arm of Patroclus. Every detail is lovingly carried out, and the silent pain of the young warrior has survived the centuries. To these men, and now nameless others, we owe such masterpieces as the cup in whose interior we see Dawn mourning over her dead son, and the hydria in the Metropolitan Museum of Art at New York that shows a Greek soldier, perhaps Achilles, plunging his lance into a fair and not breastless Amazon. It was before such a vase as one of these that John Keats stood enthralled one day, until its wild ecstasy and mad pursuit fired his brain with an ode greater than any Grecian urn. 2. Sculpture. The Greek settlement of Western Asia and the opening of Egypt to Greek trade towards 660 B.C. allowed Near Eastern and Egyptian forms and methods of statuary to enter Ionia and European Greece. About 580, two Cretan sculptors, Dipoinus and Sillus, accepted commissions at Sicyon and Argos, and left behind them there not only statues but pupils. From this period dates a vigorous school of sculpture on the Peloponnese. The art had many purposes. It commemorated the dead, first with simple pillars, then with Hermes, whose head alone was carved, then with forms completely chiseled in the round, or with funeral steely reliefs. It made statues of victorious athletes, first as types, later as individuals, and it was encouraged by the lively imagination of Greek faith to make countless images of the gods. Until the 6th century, its material was most frequently wood. We hear a great deal of the chest of Cypselus, dictator of Corinth. According to Pausanias, it was made of cedar, inlaid with ivory and gold, and adorned with complicated carvings. As wealth increased, wooden statues might be covered, in whole or part, by precious materials. Indeed, it was thus that Phidias made his chryselephantine, that is, gold and ivory statues of Athene Parthenos and the Olympian Zeus. Bronze rivaled stone as sculptural material to the end of classical art. Few ancient bronzes have survived the temptation to melt them down, but we may judge from the perhaps too ministerial charioteer of the Delphi Museum, circa 490, how near to perfection the art of hollow casting had been carried since Ricus and Theodorus of Samos had introduced it into Greece. The most famous group in Athenian statuary, the Tyrannosides, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, was cast in bronze by Antenor at Athens shortly after the expulsion of Hippias. Many forms of soft stone were used before the sculptors of Greece undertook to mold harder varieties with hammer and chisel. But once they had learned the art, they almost denuded Naxos and Peros of marble. In the Archaic Age, 1100 to 490, the figures were often painted, but towards the end of that age it was found that a better effect could be secured in representing the delicate skin of women by leaving the polished marble without artificial tint. The Greeks of Ionia were the first to discover the uses of drapery as a sculptural element. Egypt and the Near East had left the clothing rigid, a vast stone apron nullifying the living form. But in 6th century Greece, the sculptors introduced forms into the drapery and used the garment to reveal that ultimate source and norm of beauty, the healthy human body. Nevertheless, the Egypto-Asiatic influence remained so strong that in most archaic Greek sculpture the figure is heavy, graceless, and stiff. The legs are strained even in repose. The arms hang helpless at the sides. The eyes have the almond form and occasionally an oriental slant. The face is stereotyped, immobile, passionless. Greek statuary in this period accepted the Egyptian rule of frontality. That is, the figure was made to be seen only from the front, and so rigidly bisymmetrical that a vertical line would pass through the nose, mouth, navel, and genitals with never a right or left deviation, and no flexure of either motion or rest. Perhaps convention was responsible for this dull rigidity. The law of the Greek games forbade a victor to set up a portrait statue of himself unless he had won all contests in the pentathlon. Only then, the Greeks argued, would he achieve the harmonious physical development that would merit individual modeling. For this reason, and perhaps because, as in Egypt, religious convention before the 5th century governed the representation of the gods, the Greek sculptor confined himself to a few poses and types, and devoted himself to their mastery. Two types above all won his study: the youth, or kouros, nearly nude, slightly advancing the left leg, with arms at the side or partly extended, fists closed, countenance quiet and stern; and the kore, or maiden, carefully coiffured, modestly posed and draped, one hand gathering up the robe, the other offering some gift to the gods. History till lately called the kourai Apollos, but they were more probably athletes or funerary monuments. The most famous of the type is the Apollo of Tenia, the largest the Apollo of Sunium, the most pretentious the throne of Apollo at Amyclae near Sparta. One of the finest is the small Strangford Apollo in the British Museum. Finer still is the Choiseul-Gouffier Apollo, a Roman copy of an early 5th century original. To at least the male eye, the kourai are more pleasing. Their bodies are gracefully slender, their faces are softened with a Mona Lisa smile, their drapery begins to escape the stiffness of convention. Some of them, like those in the Athens Museum, would be called masterpieces in any other land. One of them, which we may call the Kore of Chios, is a masterpiece even in Greece. In them the sensuous Ionian touch breaks through the Egyptian immobility and Dorian austerity of the Apollos. Archermis of Chios created another type, or followed lost models, in the Nike or Victory of Delos. Out of this would come the lovely Nike of Paeonius at Olympia, the winged Victory of Samothrace, and in Christian art the winged figures of cherubim. Near Miletus, unknown sculptors carved a series of draped and seated females for the temple of the Branchidae, figures powerful but crude, dignified but ponderous, profound but dead. Sculpture in relief was so old that a pretty legend could undertake to describe its origin. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.